I believed her words when she said she loved me. But when I found out that my wife was cheating on me with my best friend, it destroyed everything. And what's worse, I found proof of her betrayal that made me feel like the worst husband on earth. The revenge was painful, but I decided to show who was in charge at home. She didn't even suspect how it would all end. Find out how I punished the traitor. Don't miss the shocking finale. Did she really love me? Or was it just a game? I believed her, but she never changed her ways. I wasn't ready for what happened today. Edward sat in his favorite armchair, turning a cup of coffee in his hands. The peace and quiet surrounding him felt foreign after he had learned the truth. His mind still refused to accept what had happened. Just a few months ago, he would never have believed that his life would fall into such chaos. He and Millie, they seemed like the perfect couple. She was an excellent doctor at a prestigious clinic, and he was a devoted husband working in the tech industry. Their marriage was at its peak until these changes began. From the very beginning of their relationship, Edward had noticed how Millie was becoming more independent. She had always been stubborn, but somehow, her stubbornness only made her more attractive. Over time, she started working more, which was natural for a doctor. However, everything changed abruptly after she started working at a new clinic. She began spending more time with colleagues, and then with people Edward had never seen before. Edward tried to ignore the changes. He loved her and believed their marriage could withstand any hardship. But then the late-night absences began. Millie started coming home late at night, often with a hint of dissatisfaction or tension. Her eyes no longer sparkled the way they once did, and her embraces became distant. All these little things made him question everything, but he couldn't find the answers. She reassured him that everything was fine, that it was just work stress, but something deep inside Edward told him otherwise. Everything changed when his best friend, Thomas, showed up at his house one evening, looking deeply troubled. "You won't believe what I saw," he began, sitting on the couch. "Millie, I saw her kissing some guy at a nightclub." Edward felt the ground slip from beneath his feet. Everything he had refused to believe suddenly became reality. "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "Yes, it was the same guy she's always with. I've seen them together several times, but this time, they weren't just standing next to each other. They were kissing, Edward. I couldn't ignore it." Thomas was not one to exaggerate, and his words sounded too real to dismiss. Edward felt a burning anger and pain inside him, but he couldn't do anything about it. "What now?" he asked, unable to find the words to express his emotions. "You need to find out more," Thomas said, lowering his head. "I don't want to be involved in this, but I just couldn't stay silent." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. His thoughts raced as he searched for any evidence that might disprove Thomas's words, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was nothing to disprove. He began wondering whether he should confront Millie or simply accept this as his harsh reality. The next morning, after Millie left for work, he decided to check her phone. It was the last thing he wanted to do, but without proof, he couldn't leave this unanswered. A few messages appeared on the screen, and what he saw made his heart sink. Millie was texting one of the men she had met at the nightclub, and their conversation was far too intimate. She was asking him when they could see each other again. Edward was in shock. He didn't know what to do with all this information. The pain he felt was unbearable, and he couldn't process it immediately. He searched for a way out, but he found no answers. The next day at work, Edward tried to remain calm. His thoughts kept returning to Millie and what he had discovered, but he still couldn't decide what to do next. That evening, when he came home, Millie was already there. She looked just like she always did, beautiful, confident, trying not to show any sign of dissatisfaction. "Hey," she said as he entered the house. "How was your day?" Edward didn't answer. He walked up to her, looking into her eyes, and finally said, "Millie, you betrayed me. You've been doing it for a long time." She flinched, her face changed, and fear flashed in her eyes. She realized that her secrets could no longer be hidden. I can explain," she began, but he cut her off. "No need to explain," he said coldly. "I know everything." She remained silent, her eyes unable to meet mine. And at that moment, I realized there was nothing left between us that could bring everything back. Edward stood before Millie, not looking away. Time seemed to stop. Her smile, which had seemed so sincere just yesterday, was now nothing more than an attempt to hide the truth. One question kept spinning in his mind. Why? Millie was silent, trying to find the words, but she couldn't. Her hands clutched her shoulder, and panic was visible in her eyes. She never thought Edward would find out about her betrayal so quickly. She thought she could hide everything, that she could be cunning and manipulate him as before. But now, here he stood, disillusioned, devastated, and ready to sever all ties with her. How could you? His voice cracked, but he was still trying to stay in control. How could you betray me with him? Did you ever even think about us? Millie swallowed nervously. Her fingers clenched the phone that held the entire conversation, the very proof that had become so dangerous for her. Edward, I didn't want this to happen, she began, but his gaze was merciless. You just didn't understand me. I felt like you were drifting away from me. He laughed, but his laughter was bitter and ruthless. Drifting away? He asked, raising his voice. I work hard to provide for you, and you find time for other men. You seek comfort in someone else's arms while I work 2 jobs. Millie tried to step closer to him, but he recoiled. Don't come near me, he snapped. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could hide everything? But I know it all. You kissed him, and now you want to convince me that it was just a mistake? Millie started crying. She knew this was the end. She could no longer hide the fact that she had destroyed their life together. She tried to justify herself. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was tired. You changed, and I was looking for something you weren't giving me. Edward stood, silently listening to her apologies. His heart ached, but he also felt deep disappointment. He couldn't believe she had chosen another man over him. You didn't just betray me, Millie, he said, his tone sounding like a sentence. You betrayed our love itself. And now, nothing will ever be the same again. Silence filled the room once more. Millie wanted to say something, but the words froze on her lips. She didn't know how to fix this, but she felt she could no longer stay here, where everything had turned so cold. He kept standing there, his heart beating faster, but he no longer felt the warmth they once shared. He gathered all his willpower to keep his emotions in check. You need to leave, Millie, he said firmly. I can't be with you anymore. Millie ran out of the room without looking back. She couldn't bear his gaze, his judgment. He had lost his trust in her, and that could never be restored. Edward was left alone in the room. His heart was breaking, but he was resolute. This was the end. The next day, Edward went to work, but even there, he couldn't think of anything else but what had happened the night before. All those weeks of doubts, buried deep inside, had now erupted into one great storm. He couldn't imagine how his life had changed so drastically, how the woman he had considered his everything had destroyed it all so easily. And then, when he returned home, he heard a knock at the door. It was Millie. Edward, she began again, standing on the doorstep. I should have told you the truth. What truth? He asked coldly, knowing it wouldn't change anything. I love him, Millie said, looking him in the eyes. I don't want to lose you, but I can't hide it anymore. He is important to me. Edward let out a heavy sigh but didn't waver. I already understand everything. You made your choice. Millie looked at him in horror, but there was no way back now. She had made her choice, and it was too late. They both knew this marriage could no longer be saved. Now that I was alone, one thought remained in my heart. Is it truly possible to forgive such a betrayal? Is there any chance for us, or is this the end? Edward stood in front of the door for a long time, watching as Millie disappeared into the darkness. Her steps sounded so distant, and with each movement she made, Edward's heart pounded harder. He didn't know how to react. His whole life, all his beliefs, now seemed ridiculous. He walked to the window again, watching as the night enveloped everything around him. Everything was different just yesterday. He was happy, he believed in his family and that their marriage could withstand any difficulties. But today, everything had changed. Millie, his wife, with whom he had shared so many important moments, had shattered everything with a single choice. Why? He asked himself over and over again. He had worked so hard to secure their future, and she She had chosen someone else. But worst of all, he was no longer sure if this was her only betrayal. He remembered how one day, when Millie was working at the clinic, one of his old friends, Mike, who had nothing to do with their lives, called him and said he had seen her at a nightclub, kissing another man. At first, Mike thought it might have been a mistake, but then he realized that Millie was likely involved in something more. Edward tried not to believe it. He couldn't imagine that it was true. But now, after her confession, his doubts had become reality. Could there be another reason for her behavior? Had she been ready to betray him all along? What else did he not know? These questions spun through his mind a million times. The living room was silent, and he couldn't cope with all his thoughts. Every moment felt as if time had stopped. He decided that he had to find out more. Not just about what had happened, but about everything he didn't know, everything that had been hidden from him. The next morning, Edward woke up to the sound of movement in the kitchen. He was surprised to see that it was Millie. She stood at the kitchen table as if nothing had happened, her face calm, though exhaustion was evident in her eyes. "You're here again?" Edward asked, his voice sounding both confused and firm. Millie couldn't look at him. She turned slowly, her eyes unable to meet his gaze. I didn't want it to happen like this," she said, trying to keep herself composed. "I don't know how it all turned out this way. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Edward repeated, unable to believe his ears. "You can't just call it a mistake, Millie. This wasn't just one night." Millie remained silent. She knew she couldn't convince him again, but she was trying to find at least some words. I didn't know what to do," she finally admitted. "I was alone. You were always at work. I felt so lonely. And then this man. I couldn't refuse him." Edward looked at her, and though he tried to remain calm, he couldn't ignore the feeling of his heart breaking. All the years they had spent together were now tangled up in this moment of betrayal. "I know how you feel," Millie said, trying to step closer to him. "I don't want to lose you, Edward. I'm willing to do anything to fix this." "How do you plan to fix this, Millie?" he asked. "How can I trust you after what happened? How can I just forget that you chose someone else?" Her face tightened with pain, but she still stepped closer. "I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to earn your trust again." He looked at her, and his heart was torn between the desire to forgive her and the bitterness of what had happened. But he knew he needed answers to all the questions that wouldn't let him rest. "I can't go through this again right now," he said, turning toward the door. "I need some time." Millie stood there, her face full of regret, but she knew that nothing could change now. That evening, Edward reached out to one of his closest friends, Mike, to learn more about what had happened at that nightclub. He couldn't just sit and wait. He needed the truth, even if it was too painful. "Edward, I couldn't stay silent," Mike said over the phone. "I saw her kissing that man. It was the same guy she was often with. I was afraid it would hurt you, but you deserve to know." Those words felt like a punch to Edward. He sat silently, listening to his friend, feeling his world crumble. "Thanks, Mike," was all he could say. Edward turned off his phone and sank into his thoughts. Now he knew the truth. But what was he supposed to do with it? How could he continue living with the fact that she had betrayed him? "In that moment, when I thought everything was lost, she did something I never expected. Is there still a chance for us, or is this just the beginning of the end?" Edward sat in the darkness, his face reflecting confusion and pain. He had learned the truth about Millie, but he couldn't grasp what it truly meant for him. Her betrayal was clearly the final blow, but was he really ready to let go of everything they had built together? He often lingered on the question that had tormented him all night. Was it possible to forgive such a betrayal, or was it even worth keeping her in his life after learning the truth? The night grew deeper, and the room was filled with a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. He couldn't even understand why he still had this persistent feeling of hope. Maybe he truly still loved her? And at that very moment, the door opened, and Millie stepped into the room. She no longer looked like the woman he had seen just hours ago. Her eyes held not just sadness, but deep regret. She approached him, and this time, Edward didn't step away. "Millie, I don't know if I can be with you again," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "How can I continue living with you when you betrayed me? When I found out that everything was a lie?" Millie fell silent for a moment, her face filled with pain. She stood before him like a shattered mirror, unable to meet his eyes. I know this can't be fixed. I made a mistake. I understand what I've done. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to rebuild. Edward lifted his head and met her gaze. He saw the tears forming in her eyes, but this time, he felt no sympathy. His anger remained alive, though it simmered beneath the surface of his heart. It's not just about forgiveness, Millie. This isn't just a simple mistake. You lost my trust, and now I don't know how to go back. She lowered her head, her hands trembling as she struggled to find the words to explain. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I lost myself in all the stress at work, in the constant lack of emotional connection with you. You were always busy and I felt lost. Edward felt his heart clench. Those were the right words, but could they change what had happened? You didn't just get lost, Millie, he replied, standing before her as if there were a wall between them. You didn't just disappoint me. You chose another man to be with instead of me. Millie couldn't answer. She just stood there, silently processing her emotions. Then suddenly, the door swung open, and a man walked into the room. Edward recognized him. But that day, when he had come home, he hadn't expected to see him here. You. Edward couldn't contain his anger when he saw none other than John, one of his closest friends. John, the man Edward had trusted for years, now stood before him as if nothing had happened. Millie turned quickly, her voice nervous. What are you doing here, John? You can't be here. Edward stood, completely shocked. What don't I know? He asked. Millie, what kind of game is this? Are you with him? Were you with him too? John stood there, unable to find the right words. His eyes were filled with guilt, but he could no longer hide the truth. Edward, I didn't want you to find out like this, John began, trying to justify himself. Millie and we were together. I don't know how it happened, but something deeper developed between us. Edward felt the ground crumble beneath him. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a double betrayal by the two people he had considered closest to him. His friends and his wife had betrayed him. He couldn't believe it. How could you, John? How could you do this? His voice rose to a shout. This isn't just betrayal. This is deception. Millie lowered her eyes, unable to look at him. John tried to explain, but it no longer mattered. I never wanted this to happen, John said, struggling to gather his thoughts. I know it's wrong, but there was a connection between us. I never wanted to hurt you, Edward. Edward felt his mind clouding with anxiety and disappointment. He stood there, trapped between two people he had loved, and now he had no idea what to do next. We all made the worst mistake of our lives. Now, there's only one question left. Who among us will survive once all the secrets come to light? Edward stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening around him. In the room where everything had once felt familiar and safe, tension now lingered like a storm ready to explode. The sight of Millie and John standing before him left no room for reconciliation. Millie, I don't know what to say, Edward spoke, trying to hold himself together. You and John, we were all friends. How did this happen? Millie lowered her head, her face filled with sadness but also remorse. She could no longer look at him, the man who was still a part of her world. I can't explain, she whispered. It happened the way it happened. I lost my connection with you, Edward. I didn't want to do this, but when I realized that what we once had was gone, I found myself in someone else's arms. Edward couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was like a weight crashing down on him, and he couldn't escape it. But at that very moment, the door opened again, and another man walked into the room. He was tall and confident, dressed in an expensive suit that fit his lean frame perfectly. His gaze was cold, yet he looked relaxed, as if this were just another ordinary day for him. This is my friend Alex, Millie said, looking at Edward with sorrow in her eyes. Edward stared at the newcomer in surprise. Alex? Who was he in this story? Alex stepped closer, extending a hand toward Edward, and they exchanged a brief handshake. Edward felt his heart clench. This was too much for one person to handle. I understand this looks strange, Alex began, trying to sound calm. But I have to tell you the truth. I'm with Millie, and also with John. I'm sorry, but this isn't just betrayal. It's something more. Edward couldn't comprehend what was happening. How was this possible? Now, two of his closest friends and his wife were involved in this tangled situation. What do you mean? Edward asked, though he already knew the question no longer mattered. Alex looked at Millie, and his expression turned serious. I'm leaving with Millie, he said. We're planning something bigger than just an affair. This has become our life, and you can't change that. Edward felt his soul turning inside out. Now, everything seemed completely different. The betrayal was only the beginning of a much larger game that would impact them all. I can't accept this, he said, directing his words at Millie and not even acknowledging John or Alex. I understand that we weren't perfect, but this is too much. How could you allow yourself to do this? Millie lifted her eyes, searching for words, but her voice broke. I know this is hard, and I'm not making excuses. I destroyed our marriage, and I am truly sorry, she said quietly, but her words still felt empty. Alex stepped closer to Edward, his voice turning firm. You still don't get it, do you? This is more than just betrayal. This was a choice we made, and you can't interfere with it, he said. Millie and I have our own story, and even if it hurts, we can't just walk away from it. Edward stood in silence, trying to process what was happening. All this time, he had only seen his wife and friend as the ones who had broken his trust, but now he realized that this betrayal was just a small part of a much bigger scheme. Yes, this is part of something much bigger, and it won't end the way you think it will, Alex added before walking out of the room. Edward stood there in silence, his heart pounding. He had no idea what to do next, and all that remained were questions with no answers. Maybe not everything is lost? Millie whispered after Alex had left. But Edward felt that there was no turning back anymore. All their mistakes had become part of an irreversible process. He could forgive, but what exactly would he be forgiving? And more importantly, did he even want to? Now that all the secrets have come to light, I realized one thing. The time for forgiveness has long passed. But who is the real enemy, and what am I willing to do to uncover the truth? Edward couldn't believe his eyes. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the wreckage of his life. Millie and Alex had disappeared, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His heart pounded, and his mind raced between anger, pain, and uncertainty. How did this happen? How did I not see it coming? He whispered to himself. He sat down on the edge of the couch, closing his eyes, trying to regain control of his emotions. At that moment, he couldn't understand how all these people, his friends and even his wife, had become part of a twisted game he had never agreed to play. But then, a new thought entered his mind. Alex, Millie and John. Was this just a spontaneous betrayal, or was there something bigger at play? Maybe Alex wasn't just a friend but part of a deeper plan. And what if this had all been orchestrated to push him out of Millie's life? Edward couldn't stop thinking about it. His mind wouldn't let him rest. He decided that he couldn't just let this go. He needed to uncover the truth. The next day, he went to the clinic where Millie worked. He didn't know what he would say, but he felt it was the only way to get some answers. Taking this step was difficult, but he couldn't allow himself to walk away without knowing everything. Edward arrived at the clinic and found Millie in her office. She was sitting at her desk, carefully reviewing some papers, but when she saw him, her expression immediately changed. What are you doing here? She asked coldly, trying not to look upset. I came to talk, he replied, calmly sitting down in the chair across from her. We need to talk, Millie. She closed the papers and looked at him. Her eyes were as merciless as before, but he saw fear in them. He knew this wasn't just a conversation about betrayal. This was part of something bigger. About what? She asked. Edward took a deep breath. I want to know what's really going on, he said, looking straight into her eyes. What is this situation with Alex? What are you trying to do? Millie held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. She knew she couldn't deceive him. It's not just betrayal, she said in a cold tone. It's something more. And I can't explain everything right now. You just don't understand. Edward felt his patience wearing thin. You're right, I don't understand, he replied, standing up. But I want to. You, John, Alex, what are you all trying to do? Why didn't I see any of this before? Millie fell silent again. She couldn't answer, and that only confirmed that his suspicions were correct. They were playing some kind of game, and he was just a pawn who didn't know the rules. "It doesn't matter," she finally said after a pause, rising from her seat. "You can't change anything anymore. It's already done." "You're right," Edward responded, not lifting his gaze. "But there's one more question that's been tormenting me, and you have to answer it." Millie turned to him. "What do you want to know?" she asked, barely holding back her emotions. "Have you had another affair? With someone else?" The question came out of him, and he felt how the words burned his heart. Millie froze. She didn't answer immediately. Several seconds of heavy silence passed. Finally, she said, "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "But it doesn't matter anymore." Edward felt his heart shatter into pieces. He could no longer believe that Millie had done such a thing. But what struck him even more was that she didn't regret it. You don't understand," she continued. "We all made mistakes, and I can't go back to what was before." Edward said nothing. It became clear to him that he would never get all the answers he sought. Now, there was only one thing left for him to do: step back and decide what came next. And so, just when it seemed that all the cards had been laid on the table, a new truth exploded in Edward's face, changing everything he thought he knew about his wife and sending him in a shocking new direction. Edward sat at the table, his mind processing the information he had just received. He couldn't understand how Millie could be so ruthless. The betrayal with Alex had already been irreparable, but the fact that she had added another man to her list, this crossed every line. He got up and started pacing the room. All he could think about was how he had failed to notice the signs, how blind he had been. He couldn't turn back now, but he had to decide what to do next. He had to find out more. But how? And just then, his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated but decided to answer. "Edward?" A voice came through the other end. It was a man he didn't expect to hear from. "Who is this?" Edward asked, feeling his heart rate quicken. "It's John. You may not remember me, but I was one of the people who worked with your wife at the clinic. I know you're disappointed, and maybe you don't even want to hear this, but there's something you need to know." Edward held his breath. "John?" This man was Alex's friend, and he wasn't pleased that this voice had resurfaced in his life. He couldn't say what this meant, but something in his heart told him it was important. "I'm listening," Edward said, feeling the tension rise. "I know that Millie left the club last night with another man, but that's not all. What you don't know is that this man isn't just some random encounter. His name is Richard, and he's not just another fling. He's part of something bigger. You need to find out who he is and what he's planning." Edward froze in place. Why had John decided to call him? It felt like an attempt at manipulation, but also like a chance to learn more. That word, planning, had exploded inside him like a bomb. "And what am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" he asked, feeling his mind start working at supersonic speed. "You need to find out who is really behind all of this. Millie, Alex, Richard, this is part of a bigger scheme. If you want to save your family, you have to act now." The call ended, leaving Edward standing there, contemplating John's words. This was new information, opening up even more questions. If Richard wasn't just a random person, why had Millie hidden him? And what was Alex's role in all of this? Could it be that Millie had fallen under some kind of manipulation? His next step was to find Richard. He headed to the club where, according to John, Millie had met this man. He hoped to find at least some clues, even though he didn't know exactly what he was looking for. As soon as he stepped into the club, everything around him felt slightly off. The lights, the music, the people celebrating. But through all of it, Edward couldn't turn off his focus on potential clues that might lead him to Richard. "Do you know a guy named Richard?" he asked the bartender, trying to stay as calm as possible. The bartender lifted his gaze, as if assessing who was standing in front of him. "Richard? Yeah, I know him. He's here often. Tall, dark hair. Always wears a classic suit." Edward immediately understood that this wasn't just some random club-goer. Richard had power and influence. He was part of something much bigger, and this was no longer just a question of betrayal. Edward felt his heart beating faster. Slowly, he made his way toward the table where Richard was sitting. This was his moment. Time to uncover the truth. "Richard?" he asked as he approached. The man lifted his head and smiled. There was a mystery in his eyes that instantly sent a cold chill through Edward's heart. Yes, that's me. What do you need? Richard asked, his voice quiet but piercing. Edward stood there, trying to keep his emotions in check. I want to know what you're planning with my wife, he said, trying to appear calm. Richard only smiled wider, and his gaze grew even more enigmatic. You don't understand, do you? This isn't just a game. This is the beginning of something big. And you, my friend, are standing on the threshold of something that will change your life forever. Edward stood before Richard, his heart pounding unevenly. He couldn't grasp what was really happening. Why was this man, this stranger named Richard, so interested in his wife? And what exactly did he mean by this mysterious game? He had the uneasy feeling that all the cards were not in his favor. Richard removed his glasses, looking at him with a suspicious smile. I don't think you really want to know everything that's going on. But since you insist, I'll tell you the truth, he said, placing his hand on the table. Edward shrugged. His mind was no longer functioning logically. All these betrayals, all these intrigues he had tried to escape were now becoming an even heavier burden. He decided he needed to know more, even if it meant facing something he would rather not see. I'm listening, he said, not breaking eye contact with Richard. Millie isn't just your wife, Edward. She's part of a much bigger game, part of a plan that I set in motion a long time ago. You thought this was just about betrayal, but it's not. Everything is far more complicated than you can imagine. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. These words were like a knife to the heart. He understood nothing. I don't understand what you mean. I just want to know what's going on, he said. Richard raised an eyebrow and laughed, as if something about this was amusing to him. You have one more question, don't you? Why her? Why Millie? Richard leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers behind his head, and looked directly into Edward's eyes. Because she was the one willing to be part of this, Edward. You saw it yourself. She's different. She's looking for something more than just family happiness. And you have no idea what really stands behind her choices. Edward let out a nervous chuckle. Oh yeah? And what exactly is this more? He asked, trying to keep his composure. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping slightly but becoming even more piercing. Millie knows more than you think. She's gathered enough information to become part of something much bigger. She was part of what I built. You were just a tool in this game, Edward. You don't understand that we started this long before you even met her. Edward felt his heart beating at an accelerated pace. He didn't know what to think. All his assumptions, all his attempts to understand what was happening, were now beginning to collapse like a house of cards. That's impossible, he whispered, not believing his own words. It's possible, Richard replied. And you're now standing at the edge where you'll have to make a decision. A choice that will change your life. Edward remained silent, trying to process everything he had just learned. But this wasn't just shocking. It was as if the ground beneath his feet had started shifting. I don't know what to do next, he said quietly, staring at the floor. You know what to do, Richard said, smiling. You have to make a choice. But before you do, I want you to see it with your own eyes. Richard raised his hand and pointed toward the club's entrance. Go there, and you'll see Millie. You'll understand why you're standing at this crossroads. Edward couldn't help but feel angry that things had gotten so complicated. Maybe this was part of his punishment. Maybe everything he was seeing was just the beginning of a larger game. And now he was at the center of this battle. He walked toward the club's doors, his heart pounding in an erratic rhythm, as if this was the last moment when he could still change something. As he stepped outside, he saw a familiar face, Millie. She was standing next to a man, but it wasn't the one he expected to see. It was another man, someone else he didn't know. Edward couldn't believe his eyes. He stood there, holding his breath, watching the scene unfold before him. Millie, his wife, stood beside a man whose face seemed familiar, but not from his personal life. It was Richard, the very same man he had just spoken to, the one who had told him about grand plans and games Millie was involved in. But now, standing in front of them, Edward realized this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was something bigger. Millie noticed him and shifted slightly, her eyes glinting, but not in the way he had hoped. Edward, she said, her voice almost indifferent. I wasn't expecting you here. This isn't what you think. Edward remained still, observing them before he finally found his voice. I see that it's not what I thought, but can you explain to me why you and Richard? Millie lowered her gaze for a moment, and that was the only clue he needed to know that the situation was far more complicated than he could have imagined. This isn't betrayal, Edward. It's something bigger, she said. Those words hit him like a punch to the chest. He couldn't understand why this was happening, but an invisible sense of anxiety grew within him. He felt like this was the beginning of the end, yet he wasn't ready to accept it. Richard, in the meantime, took a step forward. You want to know the truth, don't you? You want to understand why we're here? He asked, looking at Edward as if he were just a piece in a game Richard had been playing for a long time. Leave me alone, Richard, Edward snapped, locking eyes with him. I only want to understand one thing. Why her? Millie nodded, as if she had known this question would come eventually. Because you were always too busy with your work, Edward, and I was looking for something more. I was searching for something you couldn't give me, she said in a soft voice. Edward felt his heart clench. Everything he had worked so hard to build was slowly falling apart. He felt alone, betrayed. But there was still one question that haunted him more than anything else. And Richard? What about him? Richard smirked and tilted his head slightly. Richard isn't just some man, Edward. He's the one who helped me understand what true freedom is. I didn't betray you just for the sake of it. This was my path to self-discovery. Edward couldn't comprehend it. He wanted to leave, but something kept him there. Millie and Richard stood together, and there was something between them. Something deeper than just betrayal. He sensed that they shared a secret they didn't want him to uncover. Suddenly, Richard decided to reveal another card. I know this looks strange, Edward, but Millie and I don't just share a romantic connection. This is part of a bigger plan. One that puts you at the center of a new game, Richard said, looking at him with cold eyes. This isn't just betrayal. It's manipulation, and you've been caught in it without even realizing. Edward was stunned. The realization that his life had been nothing more than a piece in a larger game, that he himself was merely a pawn on a chessboard, was almost impossible to grasp. What plan? What does this have to do with me? His voice trembled. Richard took a step forward and laid out his secret. The plan was to create a situation where you would find yourself at the center of something that would become a major business project. Millie was needed to destabilize you, to push you into making the moves we wanted. She helped set up an environment where you wouldn't be able to find a way out on your own. Edward couldn't believe his ears. His life had become part of a larger scheme, and he was merely a tool for someone else's goals. Feeling the anger seep into his body, he looked at Millie and asked, You were part of this the whole time? Millie met his gaze without fear. I didn't know where this would lead, she said softly. But now I understand. I don't know what to do with you, Edward. Meanwhile, Richard clenched his fists. Now you have to make a choice. You can walk away and return to your life, or you can step into the game I started. It's up to you. Edward stared at them, feeling as if the world was spinning around him. He had only one choice. Leave them behind and forget everything that had happened, or fight to reclaim his life. But what was truly the right choice?